Action, 1893. Essay on a Critique of Life and a Science of Practice by Maurice Blondel. Stage 2. From the Threshold of Consciousness to the Voluntary Operation. The Conscious Elements of Action. It is a matter of science that consciousness is, and that it is not enough to study it in function of the exterior states to which it is tied as to its natural conditions, but to which it still cannot be reduced. It has to be so for the positive sciences to subsist. It has to be so, since in willing that there be something, through the very admission, we were already implying the subjective phenomenon. Hence, it is no longer a verbal subtlety to say that in taking the object we posit the subject, and in affirming the phenomenon we put thought in it. The internal act is certain, precise, positive, scientific, as much as and more than any positive physical fact, any mathematical truth. Consciousness takes its nourishment from the immense milieu that it sums up in itself, but it sums it up and contains it only by surpassing it, only by forming an original synthesis, only by becoming the act of all its conditions and of all its subalternate powers. Also, it appears under the form of appetite or instinctive desire. There is a victorious spontaneity of the mechanical determinism, an already quite psychological automatism. To be sure, these internal stimulants depend upon more profound and, so to speak, subterranean causes as unconscious germs of consciousness, but from the moment they arise and open up into subjective life, they dominate, by what they manifest, all that they harbor. Thus, the very principle of every conscious phenomenon is a dynamism, and the higher the clarity rises, the better it concentrates the forces and the rays of nature. To speak the language of scientific appearances, in the fullness of the world, under the oppression of the physical energies, and amid the gears of the universal machine, do not movements follow the impulses of desire? That the image or the tendency derives from the ignored determinism that precedes or prepares the awakening of consciousness is possible, is true, but the image or the idea finds in what arouses it, and in what it is, the power of producing its own movement. There is then a moving spontaneity that depends on subjective spontaneity. Psychological determinism absorbs physical determinism, and without suppressing it, substitutes itself for it, and superimposes itself in using it. Therefore, it is in consciousness alone that we must now look for the internal principle, the determining principle of action. Chapter 1. The Conception of Action. Desire, or the image, has appeared. No need, no way of knowing whence or how the point of instinct, or the clarity of the idea has revealed itself. The birth of what is most admirable and least admired, the interior light, remains impenetrable. Like those plants that for 10 years gather the perfumes and the precious sap with which they nourish the lone flower that exhausts them in a day, a hidden labor drains the forces of life to feed the source of consciousness. There is no water that comes to augment it, unless it has taken these subterranean passages where distinct knowledge does not penetrate. And when it springs forth, it is with an all-virgin vigor and purity, as if it owed nothing except to itself. What is its virtue? Where is it distributed? 1. Nothing acts upon us or through us unless it is truly subjective, unless it has been digested, vivified, organized in us. It is not an abstract representation that is enough to move the psychological automatism. Consciousness is a closed world. It opens up only thanks to the intermediation of the unconscious influences of life. That is why suggestions need to be understood in order to be followed, and why the same teachings do not grow the same wherever they fall. For every thought is autonomous. There are no two true truths for us except indigenous truths. Our desires are and are worth what we are and what we make them. The idea passes through feeling, or else it remains a dead idea or a dead letter. Intellectual light thus bears vital force within it and exploits it. The motive is in effect only the repercussion and the synthesis of 1,000 mute activities. That is the reason for its natural efficacy. The motive does not appear suddenly up in the air, or so to speak, and as if by spontaneous generation. It is the deputy of a crowd of elementary tendencies that back it and push it. It results from causes further removed and more general. It is the conclusion of a whole prior system and serves as an intermediary between habitual dispositions and the particular circumstances that are the occasion for it. At the moment of its birth, it has a flower of newness, a freshness, a magic grace, because, secretly inspired and as if penetrated by the fecund energies of which it is a first completion and a living commentary, it is all act. Its efficacious charm, therefore, comes from its expressing and representing precisely that which it moves, and the power by which it rises to consciousness is precisely that by which it is also able to act on the unconscious forces from which it emerges. This natural magic, which in the animal gives to instinct, in the sleepwalker gives to the image, its sovereign fascination, is equally the one that vivifies the most abstract idea with a feeling without which it would remain inert. A motive is not a motive without something that moves, without a mobile. But a mobile is not a mobile either without a motive. What does that mean? It means that in order to become an efficacious principle of action, the diffused energies need to be gathered into a mental synthesis and represented under the unique form of an end to be realized. They are confirmed and vivified by the very effort that expresses them, as attention is strengthened by tensing up the organs. No doubt by themselves, the excitations of the senses exalt the power of the one undergoing them, and increase the intensity of his nervous strength. But this dynamogenic influence exerts itself only by being embodied in a definite representation, and even in a determinate movement, so that the final cause becomes the moving cause, and ideas and signs are the indispensable conditions of the dispositions they manifest. Thus it is the study of mental combinations and compensations in hypnotic automatism shows that every sensation, such as a tactile impression, apparently destroyed by the anesthesia induced by suggestion, tries to express itself in a system of analogous images and ideas, such as visual representations, and tends through transportation to set in motion another sensory apparatus under the influence of a hallucination, at once corresponding and foreign to the primitive excitation. The diffusion of reflexes reaches action, therefore, only on the condition of being translated into an ideal synthesis. This necessary transformation, whose mechanism certain exceptional cases enable us to analyze, always takes place also in the normal interplay of psychological functions. The obscure forces of sense life, have all their efficacy only from the moment when, as if to illuminate them and to fix an aim for them, a representation arises which appears to abstract and to detach itself from them. Thus finality is, at first, only the subjective expression of antecedent necessities, but from the moment when the confused and incoherent impulses of desire have taken shape, and the instinctive image, or in the clear conception of an act, they are indebted to the systemic unity of the internal representation for a firmness, a precision, an efficaciousness that are quite new. In consciousness always, at every moment, states are produced that are tied to one another and unified into organic systems. And what affects their synthesis is what confers an original power on the system. Introspective analysis, therefore, confirms what, from the viewpoint of the positive sciences, we showed to be true of every synthesis, i.e., it is irreducible to its elements and master of its own conditions. Mobiles are valid only through the motive they prepare and propose for themselves. But the motive itself is no longer a motive if it does not in turn become a mobile. Again, what does that mean? It means that from the moment when the deep causes of the moving emotion have provided themselves with the goal of their tendency, they cease to be confused with the total current of life in order to constitute a distinct end. They were ourselves, they become simply ours. And the motive would remain, as it were, the abstract and ideal term, as if it were only the objective production of the action of these causes, if it contained nothing more than the complete summation of the subalternate determinism that bore them to the light of consciousness. Hence this motive, to be efficacious, to exist, to effect the concentration of the diffuse energies and launch them to the attack, must bring some new perspective and the promise of an unknown to be conquered. When we act without knowing entirely why, and it is always so, when the reasons we give ourselves are neither the only ones nor the truest ones, it is no doubt because in this approximative explanation of our behavior there always subsists, alongside some clear ideas, a vague sense wherein are summed up the natural inclinations, the hereditary habits, the slowly constructed desires, the entire organism, and the entire universe. But it is especially because the known motive dominating all prior energies exploits them for ulterior ends that always surpass experience and even foresight. Better still, the actual motive of our act is never the same as at the origin of the choice that inclined toward it. There is no imperative mandate. The deputy is not a simple spokesman. If he has the power of the members, he also enjoys the initiative and the direction of the chief. He has the elan of the improviser, for at the decisive moment it is always something unforeseen that carries us off. Thus, born of force, the interior light is a source of force. The image that results from movements is cause of movements, and thought constantly fecundated by nature fecundates in turn like an organism that digests and vivifies everything it takes in. Having come from an impenetrable origin, the conceived act then crosses the illuminated field of consciousness in order to tend toward a goal again still impenetrable. We live, it is said, only by hope. We labor only in view of the better. Whether we have a clear understanding of it or not, we belong to a world higher than sense phenomena and the science of facts. Nothing of what is exterior determines us, and in what we desire outside of ourselves. It is still ourselves that we are looking for. If the idea is nothing without the sentiment, neither does the real have any purchase on us without the ideal, and we do not act if we do not draw from ourselves the principle of our action. If this principle does not surpass past experiences, if we do not sense in it something else, if we do not make of it a kind of transcendent reality, one is never interested in one's own acts unless they are mixed in with some passionate ideology. The clear idea is inert. All that is demonstrated and fixed as mathematical certitude does not elicit active devotion. We die as we live only for a belief, when in what we know we expect more than what we know, when we have placed ourselves at stake, when we love this mysterious known, both for what it contains and for what it promises. Thus it is that even instinct seems to work in view of ends foreign to the individual whose life it crushes. Thus, again, it is in the actual incertitude about his destiny, man sometimes has the obscure and intense feeling that, in the hands of a blind fatality, or of an almighty cunning, or of an unfathomable providence, he contributes to the great work he does not know. Through the very interplay of the internal determinism, then, action hangs from an effective finality. And far from reducing subjective dynamism to the mechanism of brute forces, it is unconscious activity that serves the nascent life of consciousness by supporting it. The study of mental dynamogenics establishes, therefore, in the name of determinism, these interconnected conclusions. Consciousness results from a series of elementary and unconscious acts, not just from the last. It constitutes a synthesis and a distinct act. It prepares and begins a series of new acts whose end it does not foresee, but which it proposes for itself, at least as provisional. To conceive is to have acted, to be acting still, and to be about to act further. Prior to any reflection, these diverse moments that analysis succeeds in distinguishing are mixed in together. In instinct, for example, or in passion. When an idea suddenly takes hold of a hothead or an ardent heart, are there any obstacles? Are there any hesitations? Is there even consciousness so close upon conception? Does execution follow? How quickly the work is detached from the worker, and with what speed action, perhaps slowly elaborated, slow to have come to consciousness, comes out of it after a few phenomena of refraction and mental amplification. And if our French genius is more active than any other, more dedicated to ideas, more ready to live by them and to define them through practice, it is not a singular or abnormal trait. It is the law of the truly human character. We think it is in the order of things, only after having acted, and in acting, and in order to act. Yet the proverb remains true. To say and to do, to conceive and to execute, are two things. Why? And whence is it that ordinarily we hesitate, we deliberate, we seem to choose, when it should be enough, quite simply, to be carried away with the immediate certitude of instinct, without hindrance and without obstruction? And once we have acted with that sort of imperturbable unity, as if under the domination of a suggestion, why is it, if we have come to notice it, that we think we were determined, while in the course of action itself we were able to believe we were free? A motive is not a motive if it is alone. If it is alone, it is an animal desire, an instinctual image. If it appears alone before consciousness, it is an impulse of spontaneity or of mechanical habit. The delirium of one sick or deranged, the suggestion of a sleepwalker, the automatism of one's distractive or dreaming. It is a fixation and not an idea. Every idea, every state of distinct consciousness implies a contrast and an internal opposition. Just as the eye spontaneously brings up the color complementary to one it grows weary of perceiving, to make them both live by one another, so also the mental organism is constituted in such a way that every representation evokes contraries and antagonists, as so many harmonics meant to highlight them through a subdued accompaniment. Consciousness, as we recalled, is born only of discrimination. It develops under the dominion of a law of relativity. The study of what is called psychic polarization shows that under every perception, apparently simple and frank, is hidden the image of another fictitious perception, quite ready to supplant the first one. This also explains why, in cases of hysteria, there is a need for simulating and an appetite for lying, which incidentally has haunted certain touchy but still sane organizations. For alongside real memories appears and grows a system of adverse associations, and through the momentum of a strange giddiness, one comes to the point, as if in spite of oneself, of saying the opposite of what one was thinking, of reduplicating one's conscious life, of falling into illusion, as if the false representations, precisely because they are quite subjective, had more authority over the subject than those whose real impressions he underwent. In the same way, the regular mechanism of negation sets in motion a pair of rival affirmations, one of which manages to exclude the other, but without ever destroying it. Whence the spirit of contradiction? Whence the danger in awakening doubt or disobedience in the child through some premature question? Whence, on the opposite side of the coin, the usefulness of the temptation overcome, to strengthen the very vigor of the moral sense? In short, to conceive an act distinctly is to imagine at the same time, at least, the vague possibility of different acts, which play the role of a foil and serve to add precision through elimination and through approximation to the primitive conception. Every conception, then, is like a fraction that makes sense only in relation to the total unity and that calls for the complement of another fraction. Here are the facts. Man's animal automatism and the determinism of his life, at once physiological and psychological, is penetrated by this law of simultaneous or alternating contrasts. The internal mechanism is such that down to the very vitals of our brute life, the monotonous and unperceived unity of the organic process is shot through, divided, and torn by internal struggles. Hence, if it is true, as we saw in studying subjective spontaneity, that every act of consciousness is a synthesis of forces and a new principle of force, it is no less true that every consciousness of an act, an idea or a sentiment, results from a conflict, from a disturbance, and from a halt in the mental dynamism, from an at least partial inhibition. It is necessary to study its causes and its effects. As images and ideas arise in greater abundance, more numerous ways open up for activity, for the unconscious labor of psychological life translates itself spontaneously into the forms of ends to be realized. Determinism provides the goal that assigns itself, and, with the aid of the antecedent conditions, it constitutes the ideal to be pursued. That is how, among the different tendencies that manifest themselves in us, through an unknown necessity, contrasting systems of known ends are formed, which bear each within itself a power of realization, and through the attraction of diverse conscious motives, the diffuse forces of the interior life group themselves under a law of finality into antagonistic syntheses. Now, how is it that there is an opposition among these heterogeneous groups? How, from this intestinal struggle, does there come to be a more distinct knowledge and a new power of attention? How is reflection born from consciousness itself? How does the divergence of tendencies, ordinarily unequal and disproportionate, come to end up in inhibition? Here is how. If the antagonistic systems are opposed to consciousness, it is because, in spite of this antagonism itself, they are contained in the complex unity of one and the same organism. It is because they depend equally on a higher power of contraries. It is because, rather than being isolated fragments, they are parts of the whole. The multiplicity of images and motives no doubt prepares, but it first supposes a unity able to comprehend and produce them all. Moreover, in the presence of adverse motives, there is a third which intervenes and opposes them. Even in the face of a single motive, from the moment it is conceived distinctly, it is the case that we consider it as only one of the possible solutions in its relation to the sum of actual impressions and tendencies. This relation in consciousness of the parts contrasting with one another and with the whole is, properly speaking, reflection. It results from the partial character of the antagonistic states. But this plurality of the solidarity in opposed states is possible only through the immanent action of a power able to embrace all the multiplicity of the contraries in a higher unity, and which we have to call reason. Thus, as soon as there are internal contrarieties and a halt of tendencies, consciousness, finding one more force within itself, becomes reflection. From the conflict of energies and desires held in suspense, effective states are born that serve as matter and nourishment for new intellectual states. Instead of remaining obscure and incoherent, the diverse motives of action come to confront one another. It is reason that contains in it the entire system of the rival reasons. It is none of them in particular. It contains them all. It distinguishes itself from them all, and sets them all in balance, because it sees that each one of them, a portion in a whole, is only one motive among others, and like others, one of many. That is why, whatever the inequality of the forces present, reflection paralyzes them equally, for it supposes not just the power of one of the hostile fractions, but the reunion of all the virtual energies. It draws off from these spontaneous energies all their promotive force and uses it to bring them to a stop. Here, moreover, is found the way in which the consciousness of determinism is formed in us, for we conceive the necessity of an act under the fascinating influence of a mental representation only by imagining that the system of victorious motives has eliminated every adverse tendency, and has become, so to speak, a total part. This is to say that, considering this dominant motive by abstraction as the only real and effective one, we maintain in the face of it, in order to understand its dominant strength, the idea that it could be only a part in a whole. Hence determinism is known only inasmuch as we find in ourselves the wherewithal to surpass it. Finally, this analysis enables us to explain why, inversely, certain suggestions that end up as act under the influence of a fatality leave the agent with the illusion of a freedom. Actually, when the suggested action appears with all the retinue of motives that can reinforce it, the effects of the suggestion itself The effect of the suggestion itself is to chase away from the field of consciousness the obstacles and the contrary velities. Without any real suppression of antagonistic tendencies, there is a subjective anesthesia. A moment ago, through a fiction, we were imagining that a partial motive had absorbed the total activity, and we concluded to determinism. Now it seems to the patient who executes the suggestion that a goal presents itself to him in the absence of any other motive, and in tending toward it he thinks himself free, as he would be if he were acting with the habitual fullness of his discernment. Reflected knowledge is therefore like a synthesis on two levels. It is representation of representations. What it is sums up what is in us, and what is in us sums up all the rest. But after we have gone up these tiered levels through a necessary progress, if we look back, how will we explain that more seems to come out of less in this way? Why this victorious power of the derived states? Whence is it that, at one and the same time, reflection narrows the breadth of spontaneous life, since it introduces limits and contrasts into it, while it broadens the power of particular motives, since it makes one or the other of them able to thwart all the others? The reason is that this ascending movement is itself predetermined by a secret aspiration, which from the beginning sowed the seed of these unforeseen growths. Seen from the bottom up, according to the series of means, everything seems necessary, but there is constraint only in the appearances. Seen from the top down, so to speak, and in the order of the end sought, everything is born of an initiative, which each new effort is bound to reveal better. And that is why each later synthesis contains more than its already determined antecedents. That is why the transcription into consciousness of unconscious states creates a new energy. That is why, moreover, reflection, in concentrating the diffuse light onto one point, in a way multiplies it. That is why, finally, even this accumulated light is already no longer enough to bring us to action, if beyond it we do not still perceive the attraction of some obscurity in something unknown. Hence, it is not from the perspective of a single moment of the interior life that we can resolve at a stroke the problem of freedom and determinism. For what is at first necessitating becomes necessitated in turn only at the end. If we attain it, we discover the true character of this total movement of life. Let it suffice then to show, at each growth of the act, the forced sequence of this development itself, and the victory of the new state over its own conditions. But we must guard against reversing or confusing the levels of this rigorous progression. Otherwise, we would betray the scientific character of this concatenation, and we would run the risk of taking the necessary production of freedom, the aspect of the problem ordinarily neglected, for an absorption of freedom itself into necessity. Such is the genesis, such is the efficacy of reflection. It derives from spontaneity, and it emancipates itself from it by explaining it. It proceeds from determinism, and it surpasses it by knowing it. Born of an internal differentiation and from an inhibition, it is itself, as positivism has already noted rightly, this inhibiting and perturbing power. From the moment reflection appears, every tendency is held in check. It suspends not the knowledge that it fixes, but the immediate activity, through a power which it borrows from the antagonistic tendencies, and which is higher than each and all. Has it not often been noted, in fact, that a too close attention disconcerts what is natural, and hinders the ease of the most habitual movements? That curious and learned analysis kills the elan, the naive sense of happiness, the fecundity of life, and even love? And do we not see instincts and traditional mores sometimes crumble in the face of progress of this dissolving force, reflection? From the determinism of mobiles and motives, then, a power arises that holds it in check. Thanks to no suggestion of nature keeps the magic charm that made it sovereign. Before it, nothing has a decisive influence, an absolute value. No one thing, so to speak, merits any longer to be done. There is a halt. There is indifference. Is that the death of action? And is not action conceived only to be aborted? Chapter 2. The Reason of Action. From the moment when the conception of an act is accompanied by contrary conceptions, and when through the antagonism of these rival forces reflection has appeared, the simplicity of the primitive automatism is lost. Brought to the fore by the very functioning of the internal determinism, a new power holds the entire movement of spontaneity in suspense. But what is this power for both understanding a system of complementary ideas and paralyzing its immediate influence in order to reflect and deliberate on it? It is what we commonly call reason, and the act that will proceed from this interior labor is the one we ordinarily call, without sufficiently distinguishing what deserves to be called by that name, the human act, the reasonable act, the voluntary act, the free act, or simply the act or action. But how is it that, in spite of what seems to be murderous for activity and reflection, there is a truly reflected energy? How is reason engendered, and how does it have its own action, without being detached from its conditions, a necessary action, without its being necessitating, a decisive action, without its being determined? In what way is reason constituted before consciousness, and how does it furnish, along with the regulative notions of reflective life, the necessary idea of freedom? That this idea appears fatally in us is something certain, and it is something no one has thought of explaining. That it sums up and represents by itself all the prior history of determinism is a truth equally misunderstood and equally essential. For from this it follows that, wrongly or rightly, the absolute value of phenomena actually matters little. The issue is simply to study their mutual relations. The agent, substituting himself for all the antecedent conditions of his actions, attributes their paternity to himself. 1. If the motives and the mobiles are the repercussion in us of all the world and the expression of our own nature, the consciousness that perceives them is the perception of the universe and of the total solidarity from a particular point of view. But to know the universe, a new relation has to be established by this knowledge itself. The more we understand the greatness of the world and this immense duration where we are as though lost, the higher we are above it. To know is to possess and to rule. Intelligence becomes everything, but for it to become so, it overcomes. To grasp its object, the understanding transforms it into its own substance. We can really understand the parts only through the idea of the whole. We know the whole only by distinguishing oneself from the universe through the perception of the universal. The consciousness of a motive did not occur without the presence of other motives. The consciousness of the multiple reasons for acting did not occur without at least a confused view of their opposition and of the system they form. The consciousness of these contrasts in the midst of an organic unity does not occur without the thought of what is inaccessible to relation and to limitation, without the known and possessed presence of an absolute, and without the regulative idea of the infinite. About the presence of these rational notions in consciousness, about the role they play in the very way we look at our personal conduct, we can have no doubt. If some have denied them, it is out of fear of the absolute reality we could be tempted to attribute to them from the start. But here there is nothing of the sort. The issue is simply to determine the mutual generation of these ideas, and to explain their appearing in consciousness. And so little should we worry about attributing to them an objective value that, far from raising them to the absolute, we shall define their reciprocal and hierarchical relations. They call one another forth, and produce one another, like simple solidary phenomena. In the thought of the subject, as Leibniz had noted for mathematics, there are in the mental dynamism many degrees of the infinite. Directive ideas of reason and freedom are the names of two of these tiered levels. Also, to account for the generation of these rational notions will be at the same time to explain the production of the consciousness of our free willing. In 2 words, the consciousness of action implies the notion of infinite, and this notion of infinite explains the consciousness of free action. What does it mean to act according to the common idea people have of it? It means, in the immensity of things that everywhere and always contain an actual infinite, in the midst of the determinism that encircles all the complexity of phenomena, to insert and to add something of one's own. No one thinks he is acting if he does not attribute to himself the principle of his action, and if he does not believe he is someone or something, like an empire within an empire. This interior persuasion only translates and confirms the scientific definition, as we gave it earlier, of what is properly subjective. There is no effective synthesis, no internal act, no state of consciousness, however obscure it may be, that is not transcendent regarding its conditions, and where the infinite is not present. The infinite, that means here what surpasses every distinct representation and every determinate motive. What is without common measure with the object of knowledge and the stimulants of spontaneity. The light of each idea sums up a whole system of forces, and through the ideal action they exert on one another, the motives take over the powers they represent. That is how we can transform into internal freedom the exterior necessities of the world. Reflection is not sterile, it is the force of forces, and like a lever leaning on the idea of the infinite, it can raise the universe. That is why theory acts on practice, for thought is a form of action, which it makes into a free will. That is why the speculative doctrines of moralists are events in the formations of general morality. The decisive reason for an act, then, never seems to reside in any one of the partial tendencies that contributed in making it possible. In our eyes, it resides in this power, which none of the particular determinations could exhaust, and which, absorbing all the piecemeal reasons, seems naturally able to dominate the whole of the defined forces. Physical energies, appetites, tendencies, motives, determinism of nature and spirit. Conscious action finds its explanation in its total reason only in a principle irreducible to the facts of consciousness as well as to sensible phenomena. It is conscious of its own initiative only by attributing a character of infinitude and transcendence to itself. Now it belongs to reflection to place the resources of spontaneity at the disposal of its own advantage. What the agent has done by instinct, he can, by taking advantage of invention, renew by art. What was contained in the natural expansion of his energy, he can dominate and exploit. What resulted from an indeliberate force, he knows how to make into the goal of a new effort. And imitating himself, he puts all the power of the efficient causes he bears within himself at the service of a final cause. From the moment when conscious action appears to him as a result irreducible to the determinate conditions from which it proceeds, he makes of this result itself the principle of his eventual decisions, and the infinite virtuality that the nature of the acting subject harbored becomes a sense of free will. Hence it is because we find in our acts a kind of creative sovereignty that we have a consciousness of ourselves and reason. It is because we are reasonable and conscious of ourselves that we judge ourselves capable of voluntary initiative. Thus, the reciprocity of means and ends, which had already manifested itself in a still extrinsic way in the dynamism of nature, is illuminated within the intimacy of reason. As the higher syntheses earlier explained the lower forms, which are nevertheless their antecedent conditions, so also here the relations between immanent determinism and transcendent finality reappear. Reason would not be in us, would not know itself in us, without this rhythm of the unconscious or spontaneous life, whose necessary laws we have traced up to here. And this whole organic process would not develop, without the latent intervention of a directive idea, since it is under the hidden influence of this finality that all the motives and states of consciousness, calling to one another, associating themselves with one another, opposing themselves to one another, brought forth reflection, and with it the consciousness of a free power. The role of action in the constitution of reason and in the idea of freedom is therefore essential as well as little attended to. Indeed, what reveals to consciousness this apparent infinitude of a power proper to the agent? It is the very action that is accomplished in him and by him, and what inspires him with the desire and the sense of a power proper to himself. It is the idea of that infinite of action which he makes the origins of his voluntary decisions, a reflection and freedom that would be impossible in one who, instead of acting, would be acted upon. For there is reason in related consciousness, and a sense of the infinite only where there is a free activity, and there is a free activity only where there is consciousness of acting. To take phenomena for what they are, neither more nor less, there is a solidarity between reason and freedom, between consciousness and the power of the infinite. The real idea becomes ideal, that is reflected, only through this mediation. For if the infinite is present to every subject, not every subject is present to the infinite and knows how to use it. The voluntary act, then, goes from the infinite to the infinite, because in it the infinite is efficient cause and final cause. Freedom, far from excluding determinism, comes from it and uses it. Determinism, far from excluding freedom, prepares it and produces it. The chronological order matters little. Time is only a way of representing the subjective unity and the multiplicity of subordinate phenomena. And the necessity immanent to the sequence of these phenomena is only the objective projection, and, so to speak, the project of the transcendent finality from which reason draws its inspiration. Thus it is that reflection, scanning the series of efficient causes and final causes in all directions, and seeing whence the act comes, knows how to go back to it and how to reproduce it. It equally goes down or goes back up to the double sequence of spontaneous operations, for which it is alternately end and point of departure. It goes into nature to take up the thread of causes that lead to its goal. It predetermines the sequence of the means proper to its end. To the determinism of brute force, or of animal instinct, or of a mental spontaneity is added, not to suppress it, but to use it, the voluntary determination of the act. In short, in order to act, we have to participate in an infinite power. To be conscious of acting, we have to have the idea of this infinite power. But it is in the reasonable act that there is a synthesis of the power and of the idea of infinite. And this synthesis is what we call freedom, too. Here, then, is freedom, that scandal of science affirmed by science itself, by a science more complete and more consistent with the law of its progress. It is, since the movement of science and of consciousness are unexplainable without it. It is, since at the point where we posit what is true about determinism, we escape from it. But let us make no mistake about the meaning and bearing of this affirmation. It contains a triple truth. 1. Nothing in the determinism of nature and of thought, nothing in phenomena, nor in the science of phenomena, contradicts the consciousness of a force exempt from necessity. Immunity from necessity. 2. It is the movement of spontaneity and the progress of determinism that produces the necessary and inevitable consciousness of freedom, necessity of freedom. 3. The very interplay of this determinism is explained and consecrated by freedom, necessity from freedom. It is on this last point that it is especially important to forestall any misunderstanding. All our proper action appears to rest on a primitive foundation of passivity, and it would be absurd to pretend that it is our doing to have come through all the forms of unconscious life and finally arrive at the dawn of consciousness in the clarity of reason. Far from proving that we have to say about being reasonable and free, we have just seen, on the contrary, why we are so inevitably. Is this to imply that this necessary freedom is absorbed in determinism? Not at all. We must also maintain these two assertions at the same time. On the one hand, determinism has necessarily led to the consciousness of freedom. On the other hand, freedom, in becoming conscious of itself, ratifies all that goes before and wills all that enables it to will. From the moment, then, when the reasonable agent attributes to himself a power higher than the conditions from which his consciousness, his reason, and his freedom all derive, he could not, in willing, disavow these origins of his will, and if he could discover a motive for denying what he is, it is not in the antecedents of his act that he would find it. Thus is legitimated this entire process that seemed foreign to human willing. Thus do we see that all the movement of science rests on a profound will. Thus, when through a decision which could have seemed artificial and arbitrary, we were opting for that something, for that phenomenon of which there is an immediate intuition and scientific knowledge, we were expressing in an extrinsic form this essential truth, namely, that the whole system of an objective and subjective phenomena, the entire organism of positive knowledge, is subordinated to and suspended from the phenomenon of freedom. We must say the phenomenon of freedom, as a matter of fact, in order to stress once again that no ulterior question is being prejudged at this point. If at times the determinism of nature and thought has appeared to contradict freedom, it is only because people attached an ontological value to it, and because people treated positive facts and states of consciousness as absolute beings, to which the principle of contradiction applied. Henceforth, no objection from mechanics, from physics, from psychophysics, from experimental psychology makes any sense against this free choice. For scientific affirmations, always made from different viewpoints, could neither cross one another nor conflict with one another, since among phenomena, in spite of the very solidarity we have recognized everywhere in them, there is heterogeneity. It is through an illusion as contrary as it could be to the spirit of science that in affirming the truth of determinism, one thinks he is denying freedom, as if diverse forms of phenomena were not compatible, or as if, for example, the laws of gravity could exclude the spontaneity of vital functions. Here, therefore, we must resolutely cut the web of invisible roots that tie us to the subterranean origins of our conduct. Action has its own proper vital sap. It is always a beyond. If it was indispensable lest any intelligence tarry amid sterile difficulties to determine the antecedents of the reasonable and free decision, henceforth it is from this decision that we must start as from the true and solid origin of the movement that bears man toward the known and willed ends. Once he acts, knowingly and willingly, he is not preoccupied ordinarily with the efficient causes of his decision, and he is right, for he really substitutes himself for the entire mechanism of unconscious life. The light enlightens him no less, without his searching for where it comes from, and besides it is never looking, by looking where it is coming from, that he discovers the decisive reason for his resolution. Since he is never conscious of acting without having transformed the imminent necessity into a transcendent finality, he dominates all that goes before without needing to know it distinctly, because it is enough for him to know where he is tending. For in what he knows, he understands and surpasses what he does not know in this way. In what he wills, he ratifies what he had not yet been able to will. This is why the analytical reflection of the psychologist, by looking back to the conditions of the act, runs the risk of denaturing what it claims to be studying. True knowledge is that reflection which turns the interior look forward toward the ends that solicit the will, because there alone is to be found the sufficient reason of free determinations. Whoever is born for action looks in front of him, or if he looks back to where he comes from, it is only to know better where he is going, without ever closing himself up in the tomb of a dead past. Onward and upward, action is action only in that way. It is a matter of science that the final cause is more than the efficient cause, and it was to show this that it was necessary to define the relation that unites them. It happens thus that the popular sense is in agreement with the conclusions of subjective science. The scientific notion of freedom remains quite close to naive consciousness and to practical experience. Voluntary action appears as a creation in creation. It is an infinite gathered up in one point, and it triumphs over universal oppression and lifts the world up, because there is in the subject a power in comparison with which the weight of the entire object that knowledge expressed no longer counts. To move my little finger by myself, I have to disturb the fullness of this system of phenomena. Yes, at the moment I undergo its impression, I have to be stronger than all that is known to me. I walk under the weight of the infinite. To conceive the unity of the universe, to affirm that this universe is not a closed system, is that not in effect to admit that the spirit, with regard to the world, is like an infinite, capable of dominating all natural forces? Do we not sense, has it not been noted 100 times, that we are stronger than everything? Not always through the vigor of the human animal, but through the direction of the will, through the internal energy and the central action of the spirit. Emancipation through science will always be incomplete. Liberation through moral initiative, through patience, even through death, heroically confronted and accepted, always remains possible. Scientific knowledge never releases us. On the contrary, it is from scientific knowledge that we are liberated, through this simple feeling. No doubt, along with the mysterious power he experiences within himself, man feels assailed and often vanquished by obscure tyrannies, and this mixture of strength and weakness is the great enigma of his nature. But if he is at times like a toy in unknown hands, it always remains that nothing on the side of the positive sciences, nothing in the determinism of phenomena, menaces his sovereignty. And if it is true that his efforts often run up against miserable perils, it is never for causes that science can define, nor in the name of the general laws of nature or of thought. It was essential, then, amidst the confusion into which we are thrown by the vague consciousness of our strength and subjection, to sort out this first freedom and defend it against the groundless objections which positive science has often showered upon it, in order to reinforce the entanglement of our real bonds. Nevertheless, there remain enough obstacles to the exercise of this freedom, as we shall see, in studying the natural expansion of voluntary action. Let us hold on to these interconnected conclusions firmly, then. Freedom is postulated by science. It appears before consciousness through the very interplay of determinism. There is consciousness of determinism only through freedom. Freedom adopts all its antecedent conditions, but it does not find in them its reason for being. It becomes necessary to find the true reason for action, and an end transcending nature or science. 2. Necessarily produced before consciousness, freedom is necessarily exercised. Do we grasp the extent of this new determinism, which embraces no longer just the past in its entirety, but is valid for all the future? Once this liberating reason has shown through reflection, it is done forever. It has shown. But let us be careful. This ulterior necessity is still enveloped in the actual determinism. Hence, attentive to this double relation, we must now investigate how freedom has an inevitable influence, and how, nevertheless, it does not disavow either this inevitable use or anything that can result from it. It does not escape the necessity of being and of remaining the reason for action. And at the heart of its sincerity, it consents to it. 1. What we have seen we cannot help having seen. When reflection has awakened the sense of a free power within us, and has placed us in the hands of our own counsel, it is too late. Not to want to use this power is still to use it. Freedom is not, as it has too often been represented, and quite wrongly, like a simple arbitral power, always the master of overlending or refusing the mediation of reason. It has issued from the dynamism of spontaneous action, and that is why it necessarily tends toward the dynamism of reflected action. In this, it bears the indelible mark of its origin, and in a way continues the movement accepted and legitimated as well of determinism. Not to will is therefore always to will, and when the will, apparently running away from the difficult circumstances where it is summoned to struggle, turns its back on the importunate beam of light that is troubling its quiet, it does not cease being the accomplice of the tendencies that carry it away, while it makes a pretense of remaining neutral. It would be convenient for it to wash its hands of everything, but what happens before it, without it, happens through it, since being conscious of finding only in itself the true reason for this act, it places the reason for the act elsewhere than in itself. Adversus rationem non absque rationem vel est. It is to will against reason, not without reason. And when in fact we do not will to will, the fact is that we will to abstain from willing as we act. The fact is that we will to act. Always, then, it is from the will that conscious action fetches up, not all the conditions from which it draws its sap, to be sure, but that unconditional cause without which it would not be. To understand this complicity of abstention better, let us think of the invincible strength and resistance, for the freedom not to do is infinite, sovereign, and definitive from the beginning. To get a man to act, neither external power nor internal violence has any hold on his reason held in reserve. He may be killed, but that is the triumph of this will not to act, since death, in destroying the freedom to do, consecrates the freedom not to do. What the heroic freedom to die thus confers forever on the past, the equal and contrary power of living and acting sows in the future forever. Even when the will seems to restrict itself to the proximate occasions and to the passing mobiles, to place them in itself without giving itself to them, it places itself in them, and instead of having to serve them, it serves them. It serves them. Every motive that is efficacious over us is more than this motive. For example, whoever proposes science for himself as the goal of his life already makes of it an end transcending science, a moral reality. Similarly, universal determinism is not an object of science. Hence, we could not fall back onto it to excuse an act except by virtue of a belief, and an illegitimate belief. The willed act always infinitely surpasses what is known, analyzed, determined. Beyond what he covets, man is interested in what covets and enjoys in himself. He prefers himself to the world, because he is indeed worth more than the world. He acts, then, according to the idea of action he has, only inasmuch as he is principle and end of the acts. 2. Free will has necessarily arisen in us, and it has adopted all its origins. Free will is necessarily involved in all our reflected acts, and it ratifies all the consequences of its intervention or its abstention. It is not just a necessary possibility, it is a necessary fact. It is a delicate task to show that freedom, in exercising itself necessarily, conserves the voluntary property of all this forced opportunities with which the future encumbers it. Determinism seems to go before freedom, to accompany it, and to follow it, since freedom germinates, grows, and fructifies inevitably. And yet, as freedom consented to the necessity of willing and acting, it ratifies this new necessity which results from it. Or rather, this double constraint is but the form under which it reveals itself to itself and imposes its own conditions on itself. For since it finds only in itself the sufficient reason for its conduct, it could only blame itself for the consequences that derive directly from what it willed or excluded. And it is this determinism which alone authorizes the science of free action, or that even constitutes its object. For in the infinite variety of decisions and possible acts, thought remains lost as in a chaos. There is no science of the particular. But if this undetermined power is defined only in that it wills, and not by what it wills, better still, if in the mere act of willing must be revealed the end it is tending to, and the means it is using, then this rigorous concatenation entails a scientific determination. There is the necessary logic of freedom. What we have to do henceforth is to develop the content of the will consistent with the very movement it impresses on itself in the first elan. If it has a rule to observe, an operation to produce, moral and social relation to institute, it is through this expansion itself that it will discover them, thanks to a method whose originality is incomparable. For it is the a priori initiative of this free activity which in deploying itself must reconstitute the necessity it is subject to, so to speak, a posteriori. Thus a heteronomy of law will correspond to its interior autonomy, so that when we do truly what we will in all sincerity, we are obeying an obligation which, far from depending on a decree of ours, is for us an imperative end. Therein lies the unique character of practical experimentation. Action, in a way, provokes a response, and the teachings from the outside. And these teachings that are imposed on the will are nevertheless wrapped up in this will itself. Everything that follows will shed light on this view and justify it. The reason for the act, in the eye of consciousness, could reside only in freedom, able to sum up, exploit, and surpass all the determinism from which it issued and which it accepts. And this power is not free to steal away from its role. It cannot. It does not will to run away. It remains always the true reason for the reflected act, and that which legitimately bears its weight. But do we not see this double reef against which all these first appearances of freedom are in danger of being shattered? Necessarily produced, necessarily active and efficacious, is not freedom another name for determinism? A simple spiritual automatism, whose spring, instead of being a blind force, would be an idea, the strongest of forces? Inevitably sovereign, and alone able to bring the act to a resolution, able to resolve it by itself, is freedom not arbitrariness itself, caught between pure indifference and a determinism which, for seeming less brutal, is none the less absolute? That seems to be the alternative before me. Slave or despot, nothing or everything, dependent on the viewpoint from which we look at this nascent freedom. Is that all there is to the reason of action?